This lecture introduces ancient Egypt in the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, a very popular civilization that captured the public's imagination going back to antiquity. Now, Egypt is going to be among one of the very few areas in the Near East that supports agriculture, and its topographical location and what surrounds it will protect ancient Egypt for thousands of years, ensuring that it will be a very powerful and very isolated civilization that will be wealthy through gold reserves in the south and rich by way of an abundance of agriculture and wheat production in the north. Now, if we look at a satellite photo of Egypt, it is very easy to see why this culture is going to flourish along the River Nile. For there are thousands of square miles of desert on either side of this lush green inlet that we see here, with, of course, the river emptying into the Mediterranean in the north and a series of marshlands protecting the Egyptians, because, of course, it's very difficult to move heavy infantry, chariots, and soldiers across this. And so in the north, they're protected by marshlands, and to the east and west, they're protected by deserts. You cannot move an army of thousands of men across a desert without water and food. Now, the Nile is the world's longest river, competing with the Amazon in South America, and it flows, importantly, south to north, which helps explain why southern Egypt is going to be known as Upper Egypt, whereas in the north we find it referred to as Lower Egypt, where the river empties into the Mediterranean Sea. This, of course, coming from the terms that we would all understand, upriver and downriver, where the current flows. Now, this is also going to divide Egypt into two different socioeconomic sections of development. Now, just to show you in a photograph, this is how quickly the desert takes back over from the lush greenery made possible by the water of the Nile. We find here at Luxor, almost immediately, the desert is going to be butting up right against the banks of the river. It took a series of innovations and agricultural innovations in order to allow the Egyptians to irrigate this water, thus bringing the green agricultural production past the banks. Yet, for thousands of years, humans had lived here in Africa on the banks of the Nile, subsisting off of the animal and plant life that is going to be sustained by the Nile. And so we have annually with the floods, hunts that are going to coincide, where, of course, peoples can fish, they can grow crops, they can raise animals, such as cattle, for instance. Now, until the 19th century, virtually nothing was actually known about ancient Egypt. It was considered occult, that being an occult interest in Europe, for they could not yet translate hieroglyphics. It was on Napoleon's return voyage, an expedition in 1799, after he had been defeated by the British and the Ottoman Turks in his attempt to conquer a section in the Near East, that he happens upon the port city of Rosetta, and his archaeologists there are going to happen upon a stone that is now nicknamed the Rosetta Stone, now in the British Museum, a 45-inch tall stone with 3 different languages written on it. Now, at the time, Napoleon did not know the significance of his discovery. It would not be until 1822 when Jean-François Champollion is going to translate the stone, realizing that the languages coincide and or translate one another. Now, at the time, scholars knew that the language at the top was in the pictographic hieroglyphic style of the Egyptians because they could match them to the monuments in ancient Egypt and the productions of the ancient Egyptians. They also knew that when they discovered it in 1799, the lower section is written in Greek, because of course this is a language that the Bible is written in and that we still have speakers of to this day who can translate it. The central text, though, was a mystery until Champollion is going to realize it is a shorthand, a Greek shorthand for hieroglyphic, for the Greek scholars and the Egyptians who needed to translate between the two languages once Alexander the Great conquers that country, setting up the Ptolemaic dynasty. So the Greeks refused to learn Egyptian, so scribes needed to translate what the rulers were saying for the population. Hence we have this translation device here, this Rosetta Stone. Now, once Champollion is going to decipher the Rosetta Stone, we realize that, unlike Mayan and other languages that are written with pictures and pictographs, hieroglyphics are not going to have a word bound up in each individual image. Instead, it is a letter or sound. Hence, here we have Ptolemy written out for the Ptolemaic dynasty, that Greek dynasty in the New Kingdom. So once we can actually translate what is being said on monuments, we now can definitively make statements about the Egyptian civilization, their belief system, and why they made these massive structures. Egypt is going to be divided both geographically and politically in the pre-dynastic or prehistoric period around 3500 BCE, when we start to find remnants of their civilization. Now, this division happens by way of distance from other civilizations and the lack of a need to develop technology. For we find that in Lower Egypt in the north, given their proximity to the Middle East and other developments, and they exchange ideas with the Mesopotamian civilization, we have the rise of animal husbandry, the raising of cattle, as well as agriculture happening much earlier. In the south, in Upper Egypt, we have primarily a surviving Neolithic prehistoric civilization that survives on hunter-gatherer societies. And this is largely because of the distance that Upper Egypt is from the rest of the developing world. Now, it is here in Upper Egypt at Hierakonpolis we have the historical evidence for the unification of these two distinct regions under one ruler. Now, at Hierakonpolis, we have a necropolis. This is the first major finds that we have in Egyptian history, and this is a massive cemetery, what the Egyptians called a city of the dead, a necropolis. In this necropolis, we find that on walls were painted 3 different friezes that are going to show us that, in fact, by 3500 to 3200 BCE, the Egyptians were coming in contact with others in Mesopotamia, given the imagery we see here, but developing their own culture at the same time. For what do we see in these 3 separate boomerang-like structures here, but boats traveling down a river? So here we have a funerary scene from the outset establishing this idea that the Egyptians have, that crossing the river is equivalent to crossing from life into death. And so from this point onward, the river will always have funerary association. Now, the stick figure-like designs and composite views are reminiscent of Neolithic civilizations that we discussed, such as the cave paintings at Çatalhöyük. Now, we also know that they would have had to have had contact with the Middle East and Mesopotamians. For here we have a heraldic group, which is specific to the Sumerians and the Akkadians and those that followed them. And here we have a hero flanked by two animals. So this motif is specific to the Mesopotamians. However, if we look in the lower left-hand corner, we find something that is distinctly Egyptian, where we find a man holding a mace or club that's going to be striking these prisoners. This will become a distinctly Egyptian image and is going to be used as an image of power that's held up by the pharaohs from this point onward. Speaking of the establishment of pharaonic rule, we also find at Hierakonpolis the unification of Egypt, supposedly under the named pharaoh here on this palette, named King Narmer, who we can also associate possibly with the historical king Menes, who's going to build massive forts up and down the Nile, and establishing pharaonic rule, this idea that the ruler is divinely inspired, and even more so, the incarnation of a god. Now, Egypt, or the Kingdom of Two Lands, is shown in this palette, one of the earliest historical works of art that we have, because it is labeled, that shows how they are brought together and the significance of the establishment of Egypt. Here with the Palette of Narmer, we have an object that everyone would have had in their home in ancient Egypt, from the peasants, the workers, all the way up to viziers and the pharaoh himself. It is going to be a palette with an indention for mixing eye makeup. Here at 2 feet and 1 inch high, we have this miraculous find at Hierakonpolis, amazingly showing us how Egypt is unified on 2 sides in this relief sculpture. Now the palette is going to be a stone slab with your circular depression in the center, around which we have these 2 intertwining feline creatures. Now, this is something everyone would have owned because it is a utilitarian object made in order to allow us to mix eye makeup, which we need to do in ancient Egypt to keep the glaring sun and to capture bits of sand from going into our eyes and irritating our eyes. So this is something everyone would have had, and this is what we also find is common in the ancient world. Are the remnants in these tombs are generally going to be of ceremonial objects that are taken from the everyday, like something to mix makeup with. Now at the top, we have here the earliest labeled historical artwork, for it records an event and someone's name who was responsible for that event. Now written in hieroglyphics, we have a catfish and a chisel inside of a palace. That is happening and is labeled at the top of the work, and this spells out in phonetic terms the name of the patron here, Narmer. So Nar is the sound that a catfish is going to make as far as the symbol, and Mer is a chisel. So coming together with Narmer, otherwise known as the striker, for he strikes individuals, we have flanking either side of his name in a palace the goddess Hathor, who is the divine mother to the pharaohs, the daughter of Amun-Ra, and whose divine celestial milk gives us the Milky Way for the ancient Egyptians. Thus showing us here that the pharaoh is going to be the son of this divine mother, and that he is divinely born. Now turning to the imagery on the palette, it brings together very self-consciously and for the political and propaganda purposes the imagery understood in Upper and Lower Egypt to show us that he rules over both. Lower Egypt, importantly, in the north, would worship the goddess Wadjet, who's a cobra goddess. And importantly, from this point onward, pharaohs will associate themselves with cobras. They also are going to, with the crown, associate themselves with the Lower Egyptian crown of the papyrus, blossom, and bee. Hence we have the Wadjet crown here of Lower Egypt. In Upper Egypt, in the south, we find that the vulture goddess Nekhbet is going to be worshipped. And the plant that's worshipped there is the lily and then the sedge. So here is the crown of Upper Egypt in the south. Now, in uniting both kingdoms, we find moving forward, the crowns will be combined into the double crown of unified Egypt, showing that a single ruler is going to hold sway over both regions. In addition, we have some of the most common imagery you will find in ancient Egypt, such as the wedget, the eye of Horus, right, showing the eye, and also if Horus is going to be shown as Amun-Ra, his father, commonly associated with Amun-Ra. Then you have the falcon, which is the god Horus, which we will discuss here in a moment. The Ankh, which is the symbol of Egyptian immortality and eternity. And then you have the scarab beetle, for, once again, scarabs or dung beetles are going to create life out of death. Hence, out of our death, we will live forever in the next world. Now, on the Palette of Narmer, we find on the back that, in fact, Narmer is going to be shown wearing the Nekhbet crown, showing us he rules over Upper Egypt as he subdues this individual to the lower right, about to strike him on the head with a mace, while a small attendant holds his sandals behind him in the hierarchy of scale, smaller than him, but showing us we are on holy ground, that something spiritually significant is happening. We are bringing together, divinely inspired and mandated, two sections of Egypt, as we find this bird also lands on a anthropomorphic figure with these plants that he is also subduing, right? And below, finally, we have two men who have been killed. They are in the death pose here at the bottom. Now, in order to understand the significance of the bird, Horus here, this falcon god, and the pharaoh, we need to understand something about Egyptian creation myth. According to the Egyptians, in the beginning there was darkness and primeval waters over the land, which they called Nun. From this dark, nebulous, watery world, we have rising a bin-bin, which is a pyramid shape, on top of which is going to be the sun god Amun-Ra and Aton, the disk of the sun. So Amun-Ra, who creates the sun, dries up the water, giving us light and giving us land to live on. He then is going to create the two primary male and female forces of the world by ejaculating into his mouth and gestating them there and giving birth out of his mouth to Shu and Tefnut. Then, these two primary forces are going to fall in love and create Geb and Nut, the earth and sky, who in turn also produce the famous pantheon that Egyptians would be familiar with and who we now know today as Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and Seth. So we find, I will go over this more thoroughly in a moment, but we find that Osiris and Isis are going to come together to produce Horus. Now, Seth is going to represent disorder for the Egyptians, be very jealous of his brother, and kills the king Osiris. We find that Isis will gather up the pieces of Osiris, they make love and produce Horus, who overthrows Seth, becoming king, setting up his father as the lord of the underworld. So let's go through this step by step. First, in the beginning, we have nothing but darkness and water, very similar to the creation myth we have in many cultures, including the Greeks, including the Mesopotamians, the Zoroastrian tradition, and even in the Jewish and Christian traditions, in the beginning there being darkness. Now, out of darkness will come light. So we have a god primarily responsible for that, rising on top of a pyramid or a bin-bin. He creates the sun disk to move through the sky, to illuminate our world, to dry up the waters and give us a place to live. Then he is going to gestate and produce Shu and Tefnut, the male and female forces of the world that you see here, who come together to create the earth and sky, Geb and Nut. And in this instance, as we discussed with Horus a moment ago, and the divine mother of the pharaohs, Hathor, the sky, being made up of celestial divine cow milk, or the Milky Way, is female for the Egyptians. The earth is male. A reverse from many other traditions, literally shown here as a female form, which you find Nut in the sky. Now they come together to produce the pantheon who rules over the lands, and people worship them for it. Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and Seth. Osiris will represent order, and then his brother Seth represents disorder. We find that Seth is going to murder his brother Osiris and chop up his body into 1,000 pieces and scatters them all over the Nile River. Isis, his wife and sister, gathers the parts and has Anubis mummify the god Osiris, him then becoming the first mummy, and why everyone, if they want to enter the underworld, given that he becomes the lord of the underworld, will also have to be mummified. Osiris and Isis then will make love to produce Horus, which you see here, the falcon god in between them, to revenge his father's death, kill Seth, right, his uncle, and then take over as king of the world. We find that hippos represent the incarnation of Seth for the Egyptians. Importantly, the first pharaoh and king, Narmer, shown here, was killed by a hippo. And we know that every year hippos are going to be incredibly dangerous animals, being able to outrun, of course, people on land, capsizing and drowning people in rivers. They're responsible for more human deaths than crocodiles, venomous serpents, and other apex predators in Africa combined. Now, the pharaohs, while they are alive, represent Horus. So they are the incarnation of the god Horus, that falcon god which you see here. That's who he is while alive. When he dies and becomes mummified, he will then take on the visage of Osiris, the god of the underworld. Now, the idea of figures that are going to be trampled beneath the powerful God incarnate are taken from and have contact with these other civilizations, obviously, where they're going to show them as in a type of swimming pose on the side, seen with the arms and legs in profile, the chest frontally, and the eye frontally. Now, on the other side, the front of the palette, we find that pharaonic rule is divinely mandated, and this unification of Egypt was foretold and carried out with divine sponsorship and backing. So here, after we look at the intertwined felines, we have a massive procession, and then a battle below. In the central section, you're going to find hieratic scaling has the pharaoh again labeled here, showing the catfish and the chisel, Narmer. It's still the same pharaoh, but wearing a different crown, the Wadjet crown of Lower Egypt, right? Showing us that they are going to worship this, the different type of cobra goddess. Now, he carries, again, the mace in his hand, and he is going to follow these individuals who, again, carry his sandals and then carry banners before them. At the very right, we see lined up, as though from a bird's eye view, decapitated bodies that have their heads placed between their legs, showing the devastation wrought by the pharaoh on the peoples who resisted this unification. Now below, we have again, carried on from Mesopotamia, this idea that the pharaoh is like a bull because he is both strong and virile. He takes on many wives and fathers many children. So we find that the priest kings of Mesopotamia are going to be the model that will be used by the Egyptians, and associating him with a bull that here tramples this man and knocks down the walls of this citadel, this walled city, showing how powerful the pharaoh is. Now here we have our formula that will last for 3 millennia, 3,000 years, which is the composite Egyptian view. which will have the arms, legs, and head in profile, and the torso and the eye shown frontally. So this is going to be consistent all the way through to the end of the New Kingdom, thanks to the training that Egyptian craftsmen will receive and how they pass that on father to son. But again, we have this idea taken from and consistent with the Mesopotamian notion that the rulers are going to be divinely inspired and or sanctioned by the gods. Here we literally see the god that he is the incarnation of next to him. Now, this explains the socioeconomic organization of Egyptian culture, whereby the pharaoh, who is the incarnation of a god himself, is going to be at the apex of this pyramid. Below him are the rulers, viziers especially, roughly the role of prime minister in today's terms, priests and nobles, followed by the soldiers to enforce this division, followed by the educated scribes who were literate and needed to record all of this information and events, followed by merchants, craftsmen, and finally slaves at the bottom, which are going to support the various building activities of the pharaohs. Turning now to the emergence of large stone funeral buildings, we have Saqqara, one of the most popular and longest used necropoli in Egypt, which is going to be the necropolis for Memphis. Now, we find that necropoli, or the cities of the dead, are generally going to be on the west bank of the Nile River. The cities that they support on the opposite bank, literally reflecting that idea, like the rising sun, that we live in the east and die in the west. Now, most art produced by the Egyptians is funerary in nature because the entire point of it is to ensure happiness in the next life. Now, this is a distinction from Judeo-Christian religions, which feel and believe that the body and soul are distinct and that once deceased, the soul separates from the body and goes on to be judged to either go to heaven or hell. For the ancient Egyptians, however, there was no distinction between the body and the soul. The ka, as they called it, the soul, remained with the body. Therefore, the heart being the seat of the ka and the body needed to be preserved. Hence, we have the process of mummification being central to Egyptian funerary practice, because the body must remain whole. Otherwise, the soul can be destroyed and or in jeopardy. Now, from the 4th dynasty onward, mummification became standard for the ruling elite, the nobles, and those with wealth. Now, the whole purpose of mummification is removing moisture from the body. So they begin by removing the organs, leaving the heart alone in place. But liver, intestines, and lungs, everything else are taken from the body and placed into canopic jars. Then the body is dehydrated, being packed with salt. Embalming the body, we then are going to pack it with resin-soaked linens to further dry it out, finally wrapping it with 100 yards of linen to remove any excess moisture. Finally placing a book of spells, or the book of the dead, on the body so that in the next life they knew what to do in order to resurrect, to move into the next life successfully. Remember that the very god of the underworld was the first mummy, and the preservation of his body was necessitated by his brother murdering him and dismembering him. And so, if we wish to move into the afterlife successfully, we must imitate this first mummy and the ruler of the underworld. Now, generally, next to the bodies themselves, we find images of the deceased, which act as an insurance policy for if the body was destroyed, the ka could literally upload itself into this effigy of the deceased. So we have many systems in place to ensure the preservation of the pharaoh and his successful transition to the next life. That pharaoh just looked at was Djoser, the first pharaoh who will have the first monumental stone royal burial built for him that leads to a succession of pyramids until finally we find them completed and perfected at Giza. Here, with Imhotep, we have the first named artist in history and the first grandiose royal tomb. One of the first stone structures also in history at 2630 BCE. At 200 feet tall, we have a massive succession of pyramid shapes, much like a ziggurat or a plateau, a terrace that is going to stair-step its way upward, aligned along the four cardinal points. But this is not the design that originally was set forth by the pharaoh for his architect and high priest Imhotep to carry out. Instead, the tomb was meant to look like everyone else's at the time, and this is a type that carries on in Egypt all the way to the New Kingdom, a mastaba. Now, the mastaba, or the Arabic word for bench, is going to be a tomb that is shaped like a bench and generally made of common mud brick up to this point. Now, the tomb would have had a serdab, or a chamber in it for the statue we just looked at, for Djoser's statue, and for the family and priests associated with the deceased to come and pray and worship them. The actual tomb itself could be accessed by way of a shaft that sunk into the ground, a subterranean passage that was then walled over to prevent tomb robbers and or the elements from destroying the body. These are going to be common all the way through Egyptian civilization. Now, the development that we have here at Saqqara with Imhotep's stepped pyramid begins as a mastaba, but a massive stone mastaba. Here we have, in the upper right-hand corner, the original mastaba shown as the base of the final stepped pyramid. However, the tradition in ancient Egypt dictated that a pharaoh must continue work on his tomb until his death. After Imhotep had completed the first level of the original mastaba, the king was very healthy and looked like he would live a long time, so he had to keep building. He then extended it and then put a smaller one on top. The king was still living. He put another one on top, and then another, and another. And so we have something gradually taking shape that would eventually lead to the true pyramids that we now know today. So here we have the original mastaba that was expanded greatly with the shaft deep in the ground, leading to the actual burial chamber that was blocked off with tons of stone. Now, this might look like a ziggurat from the Near East, and the technology to create it is very similar. However, in the Near East, there are no barriers or walls around the structures, unlike the pyramid here. They also are temples, not used for the worship of the deified dead like a pharaoh. So there is a difference between the structures, though they look similar. In the ziggurats of the Sumerians, the Neo-Sumerians, Babylonians, and otherwise in the Mesopotamian region, there are going to be platforms on top of which temples are located to worship the gods. We find here with the Egyptians, this massive stone monument is there to protect the deified god himself, not to worship him. The temple to worship him is in another location. For this would have been only one part of a massive complex. We know that protection was key, for a 34-foot-high wall was designed that's going to run the length of 5,400 feet around this massive complex, protecting the deified dead. So here we have an aerial view showing the other structures, other temples that would have been used to worship him inside of this protective, massive compound. Now, in the restored plan, you can see the highlighted funerary temple here is where you would have actually gone to worship with an image, that being the statue we showed you of Djoser, where priests could come and his family to worship him. Surrounding it in this wall, we have several false entrances, and we have several dummy structures as well, filled in with the rubble of construction, thereby confusing potential grave robbers, even if they were able to find the actual entrance to this massive complex. Here is the entrance colonnade, which is going to show us the earliest remnants and how columns will develop in the ancient world. So here you find with this photograph of the entrance colonnade, the only place in which you could get in this 34-foot high wall that the priests knew about if you're walking around the structure. Inside, you would have had the first appearance of stone columns, yet the Egyptians did not know if they would actually stand up, so they actually attached them to a wall. So we have two columnar shapes with a wall in between, inspired by actual plant life around Egypt. For everything is inspired by life and the flora and fauna in the region. So we find that columns might look like a reed bundle, for instance, as those we just saw, or a papyrus blossom. Right, so here we have the facade of the North Palace showing the influence of, with these engaged columns, this papyrus blossom design. These will be very influential for later civilizations like the ancient Greeks, who then perfect this design and pass it off to the Romans. So next time, we will see this development that Djoser is going to be responsible for with a new type of monument, for a new type of deified ruler, a god incarnate himself. We move towards this demand for a perfected pyramid shape that we see happening here by accident first. This lecture builds upon the discoveries in the pre-dynastic era with kings like Menes or Narmer, where we find the establishment of pharaonic rule is quickly followed by a new type of emperor or ruler that is divinely mandated in the incarnation of a god, along with large-scale funerary art in stone for the first time. We find that in the Old Kingdom, this will be followed by an obsession to perfect the pyramid shape. Today we will look at the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, listed by the ancient Greeks. Now, what is amazing about the pyramids at Giza is that these 3 massive pyramids, the most famous in history, were all built in a quick succession within 75 years of one another. Now, we should remember that the list of the oldest 7 wonders of the ancient world was compiled by the ancient Greeks, and so the majority of them are ancient Greek monuments, such as the Colossus at Rhodes, the great statue of Zeus, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, but also some other Near Eastern examples, such as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon that we've already discussed, and finally the Pyramids of Giza. The Pyramids of Giza, built in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, will be constructed by way of 3 successive rulers, father and son, from Khufu to Khafre to Menkaure. Khufu's is by far the grandest and largest of the 3 pyramids, followed successively by the smaller and smaller of his offspring, Khafre and Menkaure, finally his grandson. Moving from Khufu's pyramid at 480 feet high and 756 feet across, we find that the pyramids become successively smaller and smaller until we get to roughly half the size, with Menkaure's finally at 218 feet high and 356 feet across, thus illustrating that resources began running out in this 4th dynasty. Now, if we look at Imhotep's stepped pyramid built for King Djoser at Saqqara, we see the impetus for and desire to perfect a true pyramid shape. But the question, of course, should be, why were they so obsessed with this shape? And the answer is the creation myth and the rise of a new cult at Heliopolis, namely the cult of Amun-Ra, whose emblem is the bin-bin, the shape of a true pyramid that rose from the primordial waters and the darkness at the beginning of time, on top of which Amun-Ra, the sun god, the creator god, is going to rise. Now, the true pyramid shape is the shape of this supposed bin-bin. Therefore, its significance to the Egyptians, as far as the creation mythology is concerned, cannot be understated. Here is a capstone of a pyramid recreating said bin-bin, and an actual example from the cult at Heliopolis on the left, showing you what they thought the shape of this primordial pyramid that rose out of the waters, bringing with it the creator god, would have looked like. Hence, attempting to recreate the same shape in one's monument would connect this ruler more closely to the sun god, and this is the best way to understand the pyramids at Giza we will discuss today as relating to the sun. But of course, we had to get there through a series of trial and error experiments, namely for Snefru, the pharaoh to follow Djoser. So Snefru is going to be the missing link between the stepped pyramid and the true pyramids at Giza, for he is obsessed with obtaining this true pyramid shape, building 3 for himself successively, failing each time. Note, of course, the lessons learned here with the so-called Bint Pyramid at the necropolis at Dashur, where we find we begin in the lower section with an inclination of 55 degrees. The builders realized this was far too steep an angle to continue building, and so, halfway up, they dramatically increased the angle to 43 degrees. Now, of course, allowing it to be finished, but giving it its characteristic bent shape. The next generation to follow those of Snefru are the sons of the builders who learned the trial and error lessons, thus perfecting that true pyramid shape, learning the right angle at which to place the stones. Now, the whole point of the pyramid is to be a ramp to the heavens, and inscriptions on the inside of the Great Pyramid at Giza of Khufu's demonstrates that, actually calling it a ramp to the heavens, a solar symbol. And remember that originally the edges of the pyramid would have been faced with a gleaming polished limestone cover and veneer. Thus it would have reflected the sun, giving it even more of an effect of being a solar symbol, thus connecting it to its purpose of relating the pharaohs who are laid to rest here with the sun god, the creator god Amun-Ra. On top of this shape, he rose from the primordial darkness, bringing light to the land. So we find that the very shape of the pyramid is connected in the Egyptian imagination to the sun itself. Thus the promise of new life, of creation, of what brings, of course, the ability for plants to grow, for us to exist outside of darkness and chaos. Now, the shape as well, we should remember, goes back in the human imagination itself to the dawn of civilization, where the Sumerians would also build these ramped structures, these ziggurats, and also called them ramps or stairways to heaven. And so the function is going to be the same, getting us closer to the heavens, closer to the divine in each example here. Now, the top of Khafre's pyramid is the only one, however, to actually retain the limestone veneer, showing us how smooth it would have appeared and polished. The rest were stripped away over the preceding millennia as these builders nearby quarried it for materials. Yet after this immense amount of time has passed, it is amazing how much of the original structure still remain. Because we have calculated, thanks to Napoleon scholars and later Egyptologists, that there are 2.3 million blocks of stone inside of the Pyramid at Khufu, at 2.5 tons each. Napoleon scholars calculated that that would be enough to build a wall 10 foot high and 1 foot wide all the way around France. Now, how exactly did these early peoples, who had only ropes, sleds, water, and manpower, how were they able to move these into place? And the dominant theories put forth by Egyptologists are going to be that they built earthen ramps to drag them into place and then remove the dirt once they were finished. Now, upon completion, we have a number of structures inside of the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, whereby we have air shafts to bring in air so that people could visit the deified dead and that, of course, in the next life he could breathe. We have multiple burial chambers, right, in order to confuse would-be robbers. So we find that the final tomb would have been sealed with a 50-ton stone block, with no less than 3 false passageways to confuse grave robbers. Here we're going to have a cutaway of the Grand Gallery and the sections at Khufu's pyramid, showing you how you would crawl up the pyramid to then walk down, and then you would angle back up this ramp to get to one of these burial chambers to worship them. Here we find a photograph of the Grand Gallery, which stair-steps its way in, giving us a triangular section to walk within on the inside, not unlike the corbelled vaulted passage graves we discussed in Ireland, the Cairn tombs. Here the corbelled arch literally has dressed stone pressing against each other, stair-stepping inwards. Thus it stands up by way of gravity pressing against the next stone. There is no mortar, there is no cement. These are merely going to be tons of stones, these megaliths each, pressing against one another, very closely interlocking in an amazing fashion. Now, the pyramid at Khufu is obviously going to be the model, and the builders are going to be reused on his son and then his grandson's monuments as their children also learn to perfect these arts. Khafre's is going to be the pyramid which comes next, and you'll notice that they all are going to be on the west bank of the Nile River, thus showing that we have crossed over to the land of the dead in this necropolis. All of these gleaming monuments would have caught the light in the sun, would have been visible as well from the city across the river in Giza, thus reinforcing this notion of resurrection, of the sun coming up. And we notice there are a number of temples. We, of course, would generally visit the Valley Temple most often, getting off of a boat from the Nile River, crossing over from the land of the living, and then leaving offerings at the Valley Temple. We then have a covered causeway, allowing us to walk from the Valley Temple all the way to the Mortuary Temple, which is generally reserved for high priests and those that would also leave offerings and pray to the deified pharaohs. All of this, we must remember, connects the pyramids to sun worship and the god Amun-Ra. We see that as well in the largest sculpture from the ancient world in front of Khafre's pyramid, the so-called Great Sphinx. The Great Sphinx here, we know, bears the visage, the effigy of the pharaoh in front of which it stands, that being Khafre. Now, a sphinx is going to be carved here of solid bedrock down into the ground, and so it remains the largest single carving that we have from antiquity at 65 feet high. Now, the image that we have here on the face of the Sphinx is going to bear a Nimmy's headdress and the standard attire of a pharaoh. Now, the Nimmy's headdress is actually a linen head wrap meant to make the pharaoh look like a cobra, hence the association of the cobra goddess that we discussed last time. Now, this cobra goddess will eventually, in the New Kingdom, seen here on the left, be added to the pharaoh's headdress as an actual cobra. Now, sphinxes, which means that we have the body of a lion, the king of the jungle, and the example that kings would associate themselves with as being great warriors and hunters, going back to the dawn of civilization, would often be accompanied by a human's head in ancient Egypt. These were benevolent creatures on the side of justice and good for the ancient Egyptians, opposite the understanding of the ancient Greeks. Now you find that sphinxes, we know, are closely associated with Amun-Ra, the sun god, the creator god, whose shape we see in the very pyramids behind them. Only Amun-Ra's sphinxes would often have a lion's body and a ram's head. Regardless, this shows the close association that the pharaohs wish to cultivate between themselves and the sun god, the creator god. Now, in front of the pyramid, the association is very difficult to overlook, as would be the temple in front of the Great Sphinx, the Valley Temple that people would come to worship the deified Khafre at. And we have a best surviving example in his, not in Khufu's or Menkaure. For the best surviving temple includes a serdab, the central room where we would have had an effigy of the deceased pharaoh to worship. The sides of the temple remain in the traditional post and lintel system, whereby the dressed stone will have vertical posts holding up horizontal lintels, showing you here how we can make an entire interior structure out of this rather early primitive beginnings of architecture. Now we find that the temple would have had enough room for priests and other visitors to the deified pharaoh to come and visit, to look upon his visage as they offered meat and beer and praying to him. That's why this statue for his Ka would have been located in the serdab as in all the valley temples, to ensure if the pharaoh's mummy would have been destroyed for whatever reason, that the Ka, the spirit, would have had a place to live on in the likeness of the pharaoh, as permanent and as long-lasting as the pyramids themselves. That example here is going to be found in the seated statue of Khafre, establishing the seated type for male portraits in ancient Egypt, where in a statue of diorite, which is 5 feet 5 inches tall, over life size, we have a rather rigid, permanent, and immobile image of the pharaoh, carved of this bluish, hard stone, with a bird behind his head. He is seated on a lion throne, thus again associating him with lions, sphinxes, and Amun-Ra. The sides of the lion throne are going to include intertwined lotus and papyrus plants, thus again communicating the unified rule, much like the Palette of Narmer, with the two intertwined felines. And these two types of plants only grow in the different regions of Egypt, therefore further emphasizing this unification. Now, the stone out of which this is carved is very hard, and so the rigidity is reflected in the pose of the pharaoh. Now, Nis is going to be made of diorite, a very hard stone imported from Nubia. It is going to be a stone that very significantly glows blue when illuminated. Thus, of course, we have the celestial color of Horus reinforcing the spiritual nature of this stone. And even though it is very difficult to carve, and you must leave figures in closed forms and positions, not in open striding forms, that they still are appreciated as such because they reflect the permanence of of the pharaoh, that he is the incarnation of a god who does not change, does not age, and so therefore is going to be as permanent as time itself, and as immobile as time itself, as we see here with the rigidity and the right angle with which he is seated. Now, behind him, showing that the pharaoh is as rigid and as permanent as stone, we have the god himself, Horus, the falcon, behind the head of the pharaoh, showing that he is in fact the incarnation of this god, that he is going to be driven by this god and is merely a fleshly being at this point who will transition at his death to the next phase of his life. Now here we have the Nemes headdress and the uraeus cobra of kingship, which of course is the linen headdress running down the side of his face, thus making him look like the venomous cobra in Africa, and of course making him look all the more fearsome and ruling over the Wadjet area of Egypt to worship the cobra goddess. Now, would the pharaoh in the Great Sphinx have had a false beard? Many have suggested as such. We are not sure, but we know that pharaohs did wear a ceremonial strap-on beard in order to emphasize their masculinity and divinity. Now here we have a good example of idealism, in which we are removing all of the flaws from the figure. We are going to be taking roughly what the pharaoh may have looked like, but we do not see any blemishes, imperfections, lines, wrinkles. Everything has been removed from this pharaoh, who would have been mature by the time this sculpture was made. In addition, we find a perfect physique with, of course, very muscular appendages. And once again, we have a V shape to the torso, all perfectly aligned to show the perfect understanding of a god in human form for the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians, like many cultures, defined beauty by way of symmetry. The Greeks will be the next civilization to pick up this idea. Here we have bilateral symmetry, where each side is nearly identical to the other. Hence, the beauty of the figure and the perfection of it is going to be tied to this notion that, like a butterfly or an insect, it is the same on either side. There are various forms of symmetry, bilateral symmetry still being one today that we use to indicate perfection and or beauty in models. So if we overlay the other side, you can now see how similar both of them are, and how we would have had almost an identical figure had we overlaid them. Now, turning to the last pharaoh here, we have Menkaure. And in his valley temple, we have another variety of sculpture that establishes a tradition. And whereas Khafre's is going to be the model for all seated types moving forward, so too will Menkaure's be for standing types. Here, in Menkaure and Queen Kemenetepti II, we have the pharaoh and his primary wife, the queen, shown in a couple's portrait and a standing type. In it, we find that the masculine figure, the pharaoh, being the incarnation of a god, is going to be shown much more rigidly than his wife, because he is higher on the social ladder. He is, by rite and iconographic convention, more religious and more spiritual in his image. So we find that standing, his fists are rigidly at his sides, his left foot is forward, his right foot is back. He stands upright, staring outward, whereas his wife is slightly behind him, slightly shorter than him, with her right hand tucked around his waist and her left hand caressing his left bicep. We find that he wears a kilt and no shirt and no shoes, along with the Nemes headdress and false beard, whereas the queen wears a long dress down to her ankles, with her hair imitating and mimicking that of her husband, showing that they are similar. Now, if we look at the figures from the side, we can see the remnants of the paint that would have decorated them previously before it was weathered over time. Now, looking at the son of Khafre, we see the family resemblance in this idealized version of these men, but we still see that interest in bilateral symmetry and idealism, where the same almond-shaped eyes, the same height of the ears, the button nose, the pursed lips, the musculature and proportions of the body are going to be without blemish, without imperfection. Now, the traces of paint illustrate that the figures were painted at one time, yet still made to look as rigid and permanent as their roles dictated, since we are looking at the incarnation of a god. Now, turning to how other Egyptians were shown in their tombs, we must look at the mastaba tombs at Saqqara. For most family members outside of the royal family, such as scribes, noblemen, anyone with an education and status in ancient Egypt, would have all been buried in modest mastaba or bench-shaped tombs, with a serdab and their image, their effigy carved in a statue within in case their body was destroyed and their ka needed a place to rest. Now, with the pharaoh and the government officials and soldiers, we find the primary unit to enforce this civilization. But none of them generally were literate. The job of reading and writing and communicating, say, the dictates of a vizier or pharaoh, or the demands or marching orders from the military, had to be written down by scribes. And so scribes were a very valuable part of Egyptian civilization and a very valuable task to be carried out. Here we have a seated scribe at Saqqara, which has survived as an excellent example of a naturalistic polychrome statue. So here we have the statue that has retained in encaustic paint the naturalistic coloration on it, with the skin tone, the hair, the paint around the eyes, the whites of the eyes and pupils, all recorded through paint. Now, because this is not a pharaoh, we are able to show more naturalistic aspects to the figure, because he is not a god. But he certainly is not poor, thus he can afford money for a statue of himself. So the lower the social class and status, the more naturalistically we can show someone. Now, the materials these are made of certainly are going to be indicative of this being someone outside the pharaonic family. For the pharaohs would pay quite a fortune to have their diorite statues and or stone quarried in Nubia and then shipped to these areas in the north. Here we're going to have in wood and or plaster or terracotta painted a much more cheap version or material. Now, comparing these two men, one should be easily able to pick out which one is more naturalistic or showing what an actual person would have looked like. For we see the effects of aging in the seated scribe. We can see that he is middle-aged, the sunken brow and cheeks, the sagging breasts and abdomen, all of which are going to indicate that he was wealthy and did not have to work and do manual labor. Yet in the afterlife, just as everyone else, he is going to continue his job, that is, patiently waiting to dictate, to write down what the pharaoh had to say, what his orders were. And this is his job in the afterlife as well. Now, turning to the decoration inside of these mastaba tombs at Saqqara, we give you a standard scene, most relating to hunting and warfare. Here we have the tomb of a 5th dynasty official, showing one of the two famous examples in Egyptian tombs, in this case hunting. Now, in all tombs, you would generally have workmen coming in, adding layers of limestone to the side that would then be carved and painted to show what happens in the afterlife. And what one does in the afterlife is meant to reflect what one does in this life. So, T would have been involved in ritualistic hunts annually, especially hippopotamus hunts. And so we see him continuing that in the afterlife. Here we find that T is going to be twice the size of his servants on another boat entirely. He is immobile and still and unnaturalistic. So note even here, the further down the social ladder we go, the more relaxed figures become until we see these nude servants of T here off to the right on the boat, much more actively and naturalistically engaged in a hunt, stabbing these hippopotami. Now we must remember that hippopotami are going to be the incarnation of Seth, for it was Seth that killed Osiris. It was a hippopotamus that killed the first king of Egypt, and so ritualistically killing them is expected annually. Now here we have the conventional canon, and the answer to the question, how did the Egyptians consistently show the same proportions for 3,000 years? Here is the answer to that. We find that they would, as part of the process of engraving and carving and painting these images, draw a grid on the wall and then count out the number of grid squares high and wide different body parts were, such as the head, for instance, being 4 grids high, and or a foot being 4 across. This is how we can consistently show figures with the arms, head, and legs in profile, with the eyes and chest in a frontal view. It follows the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the chaos that will follow and civil war until Egypt is reunited in the Middle Kingdom, and then we will turn our attention to the early New Kingdom when we have the first female pharaoh of any of the dynasties. Now, the Middle Kingdom will last roughly between 1975 and 1640 BCE. With the collapse of the Old Kingdom, we have a century and a half of constant warfare as different chieftains attempt to gain control of both sections of Upper and Lower Egypt, being unable to do so until we have them reunited under Mentuhotep, moving the capital to Thebes, which will remain a very important religious and civic center right across the river from Karnak, all the way through the end of the New Kingdom. Now, this period is marked by political instability. So even though Mentuhotep and others are able to reunite and then maintain control over Upper and Lower Egypt, it is with great military expense and cost. And so, as is true throughout all of human history, if we have political instability, that means we also have economic instability. And without massive amounts of resources and revenue, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom are unable to produce on the scale of their Old Kingdom predecessors, such as the great Pyramids of Giza and other massive tomb and temple complexes. Instead, we find, which will be long-lasting as far as a new practice of burial, in the Middle Kingdom, we have large tomb projects being replaced by rock-cut tombs that are literally hewn out of cliff faces. So now we do not even see a structure that is freestanding for the deified pharaohs. Instead, they are hidden within the mountains and the earth itself. Now, this period is very difficult on rulers, seen here in an example in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City of the head of Senuseret. Now, Senuseret III, we know, is not going to have as much resources as his predecessors. We can tell that, number one, by the material he uses for his commission, such as yellow quartzite here, in place of the hard, expensive diorite that was imported from Nubia previously. Now we know of this pharaoh that he was a good and able administrator, that he led additional military expeditions into Nubia, still controlling Upper and Lower Egypt. This is significant because Nubia is where all the gold mines are and where the Egyptians get their gold. Thus, of course, we find kings come from all over the Middle East to beg the pharaohs for gold and their reserves that they have, along with their surplus in grain, as you read about in the Old Testament. Now here is a photograph of this sculpture, this effigy, the portrait of Senusret III in the Nelson Atkins Museum. Over life size, we would have had a very commanding full-scale sculpture originally had this survived intact. Now, if we compare the portrait here to an earlier one like Cameronebti and Menkaure, we find that the pharaohs are going to maintain a fairly consistent iconographic convention by way of the dimensions of the face, say the height of the ears, the almond-shaped eyes, the pursed lips, and then we still maintain and carry on that headdress, that Nimmy's headdress, that is a linen wrap around the head, which makes him look like a cobra. Now, we're going to reveal, however, if we compare him to earlier pharaohs, the true hardship that is taking place and is wearing on rulers, much like the portraits of Roman emperors in the late period, in the late empire, where we begin revealing the effect and the war weariness on these individuals. They are no longer the perfect deified gods who do not feel, who are invincible. Now we see his eyes sunken in. We find bags under them. We find this worried look, a line marking his brow. All of these indicators of what's happening at the time. Now, additionally, what we find in the Middle Kingdom is that appended to the Nimmy's headdress, we now have an actual uraeus cobra of kingship placed around the band. So this is the next step until we reach the final version of the pharaonic headdress with the later New Kingdom. Now we find that the Middle Kingdom is followed by the Second Intermediate Period between 1630 and 1520 BCE, when the Hyksos, a northern exterior peoples, are going to invade. Now Hyksos, according to the Egyptians, means shepherd kings. They are foreigners that come into the land and rule over them. They are despised by the native Egyptians, and so they plot to overthrow these Hyksos rulers. Now, the New Kingdom is going to find their overthrow in 1539 to 1075. And in this New Kingdom, beginning with the 18th dynasty in 1539, these native Egyptians regain control over their country, over Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, Thutmose III is going to be the stepson of the first female pharaoh, Hatshepsut. Here we find that he will extend the kingdom to the Mediterranean and all the way to Syria. Now, he is the first pharaoh to call himself as such, the term pharaoh meaning the great house. So the ruler now stands in for the ruling family and the great house of Egypt. Now we find that here at Deir el-Bahri, we have a massive monument that is going to show us how the New Kingdom will be quite different than the Old Kingdom. For the great monuments of the Old Kingdom, such as the Pyramids of Giza, are the large remnants of the tombs of these pharaohs, not their temples. The small temples were dwarfed in front of each one of these tombs. Now this will be the opposite in the New Kingdom. Here at Deir el-Bahri, you have the royal architect Sinmut designing the funerary temple for Hatshepsut. Now, we note that all we can actually see is the temple itself out front. Her tomb is actually embedded deep within the mountain. Now, the architect here, the named architect, we believe is Senmut. At the time, we know that he was Hatshepsut's chancellor and possibly her lover. Now, the notion that they were lovers is going to be given credence by the graffiti that is inscribed within the temple, which has both of them in compromising positions. Now, Hatshepsut is going to be the fourth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. She is the queen and half-sister of Thutmose II. Now, this is how she is able to gain power for herself as the first female pharaoh in history. In 1479 BCE, she will be named regent for Thutmose III, a son by a minor wife, not her son, when he was 12 years old. Thus, he was going to be too young to rule, so we need to put someone in charge until he comes of age, usually around 18 years of age. Only we find that Hatshepsut is going to rule much longer than they intended a few years. She rules for nearly a decade and a half here. Obviously, we find that she needs an argument and a series of images as propaganda to promote her as the official regent, seeing the true potential of her stepson, here shown very often holding him, even though he was already 12 years old at the time, but reinforcing this notion that she is protecting the future pharaoh. Eventually, she will give up on trying to be the regent and then name herself, start calling herself pharaoh. And so if you're going to be a pharaoh, you need to build like one. And that's what we see here in a massive series of ramped colonnaded terraces that originally had very lush gardens, which would be significant and stand out because we are in a desert here at Deir el-Bahri. So we find this is very much like the environment where the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were created, because of course we have to irrigate these areas and bring in exotic plants from other parts of the kingdom, in this case an expedition that the queen went on. Now here, the temple is going to be much larger, but still modeled on an earlier temple of Mentuhotep II, thus tying herself to a distinguished earlier pharaoh, using the same plan for the temple and merely expanding it, making it much larger. So here we have the ruins on the other side of her temple of what this is based on. Now, the cliffs behind the temple, given the verticality of the columns that she includes, are meant to relate to the permanence and stability of the mountain itself, because, of course, her rule is very unstable, being the first female pharaoh, and so she needs to convince people of the fact that she will always be pharaoh, that she will always be the official ruler of Egypt, the incarnation of Horus, and her father being Amun-Ra. She even states clearly that she wishes her titulary to abide like the mountains. When the sun shines, its rays are bright upon the titulary of my majesty. My Horus is high upon the standard forever. Thus, of course, her divinity is going to be reminded of here looking at this temple, and is going to be as permanent as her incarnation as a god. Now, the columns that are used here show us how far the Egyptians have progressed in their knowledge of architecture. For unlike the stepped pyramid at Djoser and the attached columns there, now they are freestanding. The Egyptians realize they will stand up on their own. And here we find they are not fully in the round, but are beveled or angled on the sides. Hence, we have chamfered pillars, which will, of course, make up this post and lintel system in the front of this temple that gives you the vertical elements, much like the striations in the temple above and the mountains behind, and will be the model for early Greek architecture to come, nearly 1,000 years later. Now, the inscriptions on the inside of her temple are going to herald her and hold her up as a great leader. For she is a woman, and even in Egyptian custom, whereby she might have been made pharaoh, but women are not allowed to go into battle. Therefore, she could not claim to be a great military leader. But she still needs to extend the boundaries of the Egyptian empire. So she puts together an expedition to go to the land of Punt on the Red Sea outside of Egypt and brings back plants and animals from there and plants them in front of her very temple. Here we see people carrying these uprooted trees and sailing back from this land of Punt. In the front of the temple, leading to this ceremonial avenue of sphinxes, we have guardian figures, and just like the earlier pharaohs of Giza and at Karnak, we will see that sphinxes are the preferred Egyptian guardian figure to ward off evil and to protect the deified dead. So leading up to these massive ramps that we can see from 1,000 yards away, there is no surprise coming in the Egyptian design here. We would have to walk past dozens of these images of Hatshepsut as a sphinx. And here we have one of these standard images where her face is going to remain human, but her body is that of a lion, while she is still wearing the striated Nimmy's headdress and the false beard, thus communicating that she is the cobra of kingship and that she still wears the strap-on beard, the ceremonial beard that all pharaohs do. Now you'll notice in the sphinxes, they keep the tradition going back to the largest sculpture from antiquity, that being the Great Sphinx with the face of Menkaure on it at Giza. Now did, once again, Menkaure's Great Sphinx originally have a false beard as we see here? Perhaps, we do not know. There are several theories. But what we should take note of is how Hatshepsut is going to not show herself distinctly as a woman in most of these, but will minimize her femininity to maximize her association with earlier models of male pharaohs, thus giving her the same authority as a man. Now this can also be seen in many sculptures that were smashed and destroyed at the end of her rule, and then her temple buried and forgotten. Now these sculptures very often showed the pharaoh in a male guise, holding globular offering jars. Now approximately 200 of these statues would have been smashed and dug into and dumped into a massive pit next to the temple. Now, when reassembling them, we can see that she is appealing to a very clever strategy to reinforce her own divinity. For priests would often use incense-burning globular offering jars to honor the god Amun-Ra, the creator god. Now, Hatshepsut, in these reliefs and engravings inside of the temple and inscribed on her statues, claims to be the daughter of Amun-Ra, and we even see images in the temple of Amun-Ra making love to her mother and then Hatshepsut being born, showing that she is a direct descendant of the creator god, as are all other pharaohs. Now we know that we find pharaohs would not kneel before any other mortal. So she must be worshiping and kneeling before her father, the chief god Amun-Ra. Now here we have many different guises that she is in, again holding globular offering jars and kneeling before her divine father, and even using again a masculine pronoun to describe her as him very often in these inscriptions. So in some of the images, we do find the pharaoh does accept her femininity and shows herself with breasts, but even then, she keeps the iconographic convention of the Nimmy's headdress. So here we find that the way in which individuals can recognize who a pharaoh is, just as today we have certain markers for what someone in power would wear, and so we can identify them easily. So too did the ancient Egyptians understand this linen headdress, this false beard, this cobra on the top of the headdress on the mantle here, all of which are codes for iconographic conventions for understanding what a pharaoh is. Even in the positioning of her body, the makeup and musculature of it, and then her dress. For you notice here that she is shown as a he. She is shirtless, she is wearing a kilt, and has, again, the male torso that's going to be established in the Old Kingdom that we saw with examples like the seated statue of Khafre, and once again the standing statue of Menkaure. So this just shows us that if she were to be taken seriously, she had to adopt the same symbolism, the same markers that communicated power earlier for pharaohs before her. Following Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty, we have the last great warrior pharaoh, Ramses II, who rules, not lives, but rules for nearly 7 decades. And as is the case for all Egyptian pharaohs, it is expected that he continue building projects until his death. Therefore, we have monuments with Ramses II and his face, name, and his deeds chiseled across Egypt. Now, this is going to be the pharaoh mentioned in the book of Exodus, who supposedly is holding the Israelites. He fights the Hittites in the north and expands the territory all the way into Syria and beyond. And he builds many temples and complexes, such as that at the second cataract of the Nile, Abu Simbel. At the temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, we have the tradition in the New Kingdom carried on, where we have the most visible and prominent elements on the exterior, not relating to the tomb, but instead the temple out front. Now, this is going to be the site of an engineering marvel in 1968, when this temple was moved 700 feet to avoid submersion in the Aswan High Dam. It was then, with a coalition of American, Egyptian, and European archaeologists and engineers, taken apart piece by piece and reassembled, this entire mountain reassembled, 700 feet away. In reassembling these massive colossi, which there are 4 of, with the face of Ramses II on each one, we find that at 12 times the size of an ancient Egyptian that we are sacrificing detail for scale here, as he is shown seated rigidly at a right angle with his arms on his knees as he stares out, wearing the false beard, the uraeus cobra of kingship, and the Nemes headdress, clearly being identified as a pharaoh and as Horus incarnate in this world. Elsewhere on the exterior of the temple, we have the pharaoh shown as a conqueror, as he brings back and subjugates all of these various slaves from the Hittite Empire in sunken relief. Now, unlike regular low relief, sunken relief actually cuts into, in a negative fashion, the dark outlines and contours of these figures. Thus, it's going to be inset behind the surface of the stone wall instead of projecting from it in other examples. This gives a very clear, graphic, and visible way in which to communicate at a distance given the shadows and contours that are created. Now, just like other temples, we find the exterior has 4 effigies of the pharaoh, massive statues dedicated to him, while on the interior we move into the underworld, where the actual inner sanctuary and crypt would be. Now, as in New Kingdom examples like Senmut's funerary temple of Hatshepsut, we find that the tombs, which earlier would have been the most prominent, are now hidden inside of the mountains themselves. We must enter inside, and of course only pharaohs and high priests are allowed to do so, in order to find the final statues and burial places. As we enter into the mountainside, we find carved out of the living rock itself, we have entering into the crypt, as though we are entering into the underworld, walking beside and in between these massive statues. The statues are going to show the pharaoh Ramses II in the guise of Osiris, the god of the underworld. Now, he is shown as a statue or column, and when they are male, these are known as Atlantids, or as the Greeks will call them, Herms. Now we find that the pharaoh is shown as Osiris with his arms rigidly bound to his body in an X shape, carrying a riding crop and a whip, and then he's going to be in the pose of the first mummy, because Osiris was the first mummy to enter the underworld, thus he rules over it. At the same time, across the river in Thebes, the capital, we have very exciting activities in tomb decoration showing us a new direction and forecasting that something is about to change in the new kingdom, because we see relaxing conventions. Here we find Nebamun hunting birds in the tomb of Nebamun in Thebes from 1390 to 1352 BCE. Now, in his tomb, we find there are generally only two types of decorations, that relating to agriculture and hunting to be common in ancient Egypt. In this case, we find that hunting is illustrated, showing us what he is doing in his eternal afterlife. Now, this is painted in fresco secco, which is painted on dry lime plaster, appropriate for Egypt because it must stay out of the sunlight and away from moisture. So desert tombs are perfect for this technique, which allows a great amount of detail, such as the fur on the cat, or the scales on the fish, or the feathers on these birds. Now we know that, thanks to the hieroglyphic decoration behind him, that he is a scribe and counter of grain, having a very important job in ancient Egypt to record and then distribute grain production to the peoples. Here we find that behind him, the hieroglyphics tell us that Nebamun is enjoying recreation in his eternal afterlife. So generally, whatever is illustrated in a scene will be also elaborated on in the hieroglyphics. Now, in the hierarchy of scale, we find that Nebamun is much larger than his wife directly behind him and his daughter below him. He is taking part in an activity that he would have in his life given his station, which is recreational hunting. However, this goes beyond recreational sport into the allegorical, because just as hippopotamus hunts, which are going to reenact the hunting scenes that reference Horus hunting his father's murderer, Seth, we still have that carried out here. That's how we celebrate the victory of justice over vice that Horus won, and so we also hunt on the Nile. Now, the active pose is traditionally reserved only for pharaohs when it comes to this particular one. Naturalism is generally only common in the lower classes, whereas with T watching hippopotamus hunt, his servants who are nude are doing the actual hunting. He is stationary and immobile. This is going to take its cue from those early images of pharaohs with the right arm raised. In this case, the mirror reverse, we find Nebamun has his left arm raised, about to strike 3 birds he has grasped with his right hand. Whereas the pharaoh would be striking down an enemy with his right hand held by his left with the hair of the enemy. Now, this relaxing of conventions is going to tell us that things are already changing in ancient Egypt. This lecture will conclude the series on ancient Egypt, and will look at the art from the mid-14th century BCE, when we will see a religious and political upheaval, until Egypt is conquered by Alexander the Great and his army, setting up the Ptolemaic dynasty, followed by the rule by the Romans. Now, in the middle of the 14th century BCE, where we left off last time, we have a religious revolution when the capital will move, uprooting everyone who is around the royal court and depends on it, from Thebes, and moves it to what is at the time a desert in the middle of nowhere, Tel El Amarna today, but is renamed Akhenaten after the new king who decides to move the capital. The new capital included not only a new palace and pylon temple for religious worship for a new type of religion, but also all of the necessary additional structures for the vizier, for the army, for the priests, and other individuals associated with the royal court. The new city was built for this pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, who would change his name to Akhenaten. Now, ruling for nearly 2 decades, he is going to institute a radical new religion and break with the old, for he abandons the worship of the pantheon, or many gods polytheistically in ancient Egyptian religion, and focuses on only one god in their place, Aton. Now, he even associates himself with the god, renaming himself Aton, thus the living spirit of Aton, associating himself, as so many rulers had before, as the representative of God on earth. Now, changing one's name to reflect a god you would like to associate yourself with is not new. If we look to the Old Kingdom, we have several pharaohs repeatedly naming themselves after Amun-Ra, such as Menkaure, Khafre, and others. So this strategy is well known among the ancient Egyptians, and they would have easily identified this new name with this new god, which, by the way, is not new. The god that he is referring to is the actual disk of the sun that previously Amun-Ra had controlled and created out of the bin that arose from the primordial waters at the beginning of time. Now, this disk was just an object, the sun that moves across the sky, much like Helios and his relationship to Apollo in the Greco-Roman religion. Now, if we look at the representation of Aton, we can see why there will be a new style developed in order to record what he will look like and what his followers look like. Because before, the standard imagery for Egyptian gods is going to be an anthropomorphic one. That being on the right here, you see the gods next to this man, and they have male features and or a human body with animal heads that are indicative of what they are responsible for, such as Horus in this instance having a falcon head. The new god necessitated a new style in order to communicate that this shift to monotheism had taken place. Here, in images of the pharaoh Akhenaten that were found broken and buried in the abandoned capital at Tel El Amarna today, we see the massive effigy of the pharaoh and this new style that departs radically from the ideal of earlier pharaohs. Here at 13 feet tall, we have a massive statue of the pharaoh crossing his arms like the god Osiris. He is shirtless, wearing a kilt as earlier pharaohs, and has the Nemes headdress with the uraeus cobra of kingship on it. In addition to that, the 2 other crowns stacked together for the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, the style, known as the Amarna style, is going to be indicative of the Amarna period. Therefore, this is a period style designation, the 18 years in which Akhenaten was in control. This style can be defined as androgynous, just like the sexless sun disk that the pharaoh and his people now worship. Aton is not male nor female. Aton is the disk of light in the sky. Therefore, we are going to de-emphasize masculine and feminine characteristics. Instead, we will show them together in a rather effeminate approach to masculine figures and vice versa. So this is going to be relatively straightforward at this point. Pharaohs are going to show themselves as Osiris in the underworld because they are going to, after transitioning to the next life, take on that role after they battle Apophis, the worm that would eat the sun on the night leading into the next morning. However, if we compare Akhenaten to earlier standing types of pharaohs, we see the radical departure that his artists have taken here, in that he is fairly attenuated and stretched out. And in addition, we notice these protruding hips, these luscious large lips, almond-shaped eyes, and of course the hands will nearly always cover the chest, so we cannot identify him as having either pectoral muscles or breasts. Thus we have this androgynous approach to the decorative elements here and the design. So this androgyny is going to demand a type of feminization of the male form. He's rather effeminate and womanly in many ways, having these soft curving contours, a long face with full lips, a protruding belly, and finally the wide female hips. So this is going to have led some archaeologists to the conclusion that perhaps he actually looked this way and had a hormonal imbalance or disorder which caused him to take on feminine features. However, if we compare it to the earlier types, we still are retaining the iconographic conventions for a pharaoh, in which we have the Nemes headdress, we have the false beard, the uraeus cobra of kingship being associated with it, and still roughly the same proportions from the ratio of the ears to the overall face. That has not changed, only it has become more effeminate. So the question is going to remain between archaeologists, anthropologists, and art historians. Is this going to be what he looked like, or is this going to be a reaction against an older style, thus signaling a new religion and a new type of ruler, one that is going to speak for the gods directly instead of the priests? Now, to answer that question, we need to look at the rest of the family. And we note that the same features can be found throughout all of them. Here, his wife, the bust of Nefertiti, we get a good indication as to how universal this Amarna style actually was and how it was applied to many different figures in the period. Now, the style being so influential, it's going to show Nefertiti here as the attenuated, graceful, and soft, effeminate, curving features, and the same as her husband. She's often shown the same height and wearing the same headdresses as her husband Akhenaten, who often regarded her in inscriptions as an equal shareholder in power. Here we have the portrait bust seen from the left-hand side because it is unfinished, found in a workshop when it was abandoned. The city was abandoned and it moved back to Thebes at the end of this era. That's why she does not have a left eye. Now, Nefertiti's name means the beautiful one is here, and everyone agreed that she was quite beautiful. That being captured in the elegant, royal, and sophisticated representation of the queen here, which makes sense if we compare it to her husband. Looking at both of them side by side, we start to notice the same features, the elongation or attenuation, the curvilinear forms that are going to sweep around the figure quite gracefully and in an effeminate way, with the full and pouting lips being the final touch to this rather androgynous style. Now the question still remains, did they look like this? And we can definitively state no. Because the style is used for the entire household, here we find that Akhenaten and Nefertiti only had daughters. They did not have a son, which leads to the struggle for power at his death. But when we look at the images of his daughters, we notice they have the same type of graceful elongation, in many cases showing a bulbous protrusion off the back of their head. This leads to the question, did they practice head binding in ancient Egypt? Because other cultures did, such as Peruvian cultures and those in Africa, to where a child's skull is going to be fusing in the early years of life. So if you put a board on either side and tie it, you can elongate the skull to get a different type of shape to the skull, which was seen as divine and or aesthetically pleasing to different cultures. Looking at the mummies, though, of this family, they did not look like this. They did not practice head binding. Therefore, it is a style that is meant to indicate the shift that we have in ancient Egypt to a new religion. Here we have another painting of the daughters. Standard for ancient Egyptian culture, girls would wear no shirt but a long series of necklaces that would cover their chest until they reached puberty. Now, in the stele here from Tel El Amarna, we have a very unusual scene for ancient Egypt. For we see the pharaoh, his chief wife and queen, and their daughters engaged in a rather candid family portrait, exchanging and embracing one another affectionately. So in this sunken relief, not unlike what we looked at the Temple of Abu Simbel from Ramses II and at Karnak, we have a negative relief in which we are cutting into the stone to cast these deep shadows and contours, much like we have cut it out with a cookie cutter. Now here we have Aton in the center, that sun disk, which is the only god that Egyptians are allowed to worship under Akhenaten, who is going to be giving eternal life to the royal family. Little hands come out from the rays of the sun and are holding ankhs, the symbols of eternal life, as Akhenaten on the left is going to be seated just slightly higher than his chief queen, the beautiful one is here, or Nefertiti on the right, but they are shown very similarly. They both are going to have two billowing ribbons coming off the back of their head. Their pharaonic headgear looks very similar. Both of them wear a uraeus cobra of kingship. And then their bodies and the type is also similar, in which we have the large flowing hips and protruding abdomen, the small shoulders and elongated neck, and the large protruding lips and the soft curvilinear features of the face. Looking closely, we can see the hands reaching out and putting these ankhs right under the noses and the mouths of these figures. So the chief god is blessing this family, and we see them exchanging affectionate embraces and even kisses, which is entirely unheard of in royal portraits prior to this point. Now, because we have a new religion, we are now relaxing the conventions that would have only allowed pharaohs to be shown rigidly standing upward and or seated at a right angle. Now, in a relaxed fashion, they interact and engage with one another. We do not see the rigid, immobile, and permanent god-like features earlier used to describe and to portray pharaohs. Now we have a loving family man, father, and husband. Now, unfortunately for Akhenaten, his isolationist policy meant that everything outside of Amarna was ignored. Therefore, his duties as pharaoh were seen to be neglected, and so the rest of the country felt as though they were also being neglected. So we find that with his death, the old priestly class and the populace rose up to seize power once again and to return things to the way they were. Part of that strategy is to move worship back to Karnak and resume worshiping the pantheon or all Egyptian gods, not just Aton. So we find that when the capital moves back to Thebes, when the priestly class moves back and starts worshiping at Karnak once again, Akhenaten's city is abandoned and his images are destroyed, much like the heretical pharaoh as she was seen after her death, Hatshepsut. She also is going to find her effigies destroyed, as all unpopular political rulers do after their reign ends. This strategy of trying to return the religion and the capital to their previous glories is going to require a puppet pharaoh for a short time. And we find that after Akhenaten died, he did not have a very clear rightful heir, for Nefertiti did not give birth to a son. So we find that Tutankhamen, one of the most famous pharaohs in all of history because of an accident that we will discuss momentarily, becomes pharaoh, most likely being Akhenaten's son by a minor wife. Therefore, he legitimately could rule because we find pharaohs have many wives just in case they do not have a son with their primary wife as a backup. But we also know that he was too young when his father died to take over. And so, as with Hatshepsut, we often find regents will be assigned to them. Now, Tutankhamen rules for a very short time and then dies at 18 years of age, usually the period in which pharaohs can take over and rule themselves. Now, Tutankhamen, or King Tut, is arguably the most widely known and famous pharaoh that most people can name. However, he is not significant in really any way, for the important things he actually accomplished are as follows. He is going to die, and he manages not to have his tomb looted by robbers and or grave robbers here. So here we have Howard Carter discovering the tomb in 1922, intact. And what we find with the tomb is that his death was relatively unexpected and sudden. And so they had to rush, to hurry, to prepare everything for the pharaoh's afterlife, including even his mummy. Now, the tomb of King Tut, or Tutankhamen, again connecting him to the new god, changing his name to reflect Amen for Amen-Ra, as opposed to Akhenaten, for instance. Here we have the three primary chambers along with an annex, where we have the burial chamber with several coffins within coffins. Then we have the treasury, as it is nicknamed, with various implements such as boats and once again a litter to carry the pharaoh in processions. In the antechamber and annex, we have soldiers to protect him. We have chairs for him to sit on. We have wheels as backups for chariots and various other sundries. In the innermost chamber, where we find his burial chamber to be, we have the pharaoh painted on the wall being greeted by the other gods in the next life, as one does when they transfer or transition over to the next life. To illustrate how extravagant and how sumptuous other Egyptian tombs must have been, here we have a pharaoh who died unexpectedly at 18 years of age, whereas we have others like Ramses II ruling for 67 years. And even here in King Tut's tomb, we manage to find that the coffin is itself, just one of these coffins, a 1/4 ton of gold. So the amount of riches in this relatively unknown and insignificant pharaoh's tomb is staggering. Now here we have, as is common to protect the pharaoh, a series of coffins and then innermost coffins as well protecting the mummy. On it we have the pharaoh himself shown in the guise of Osiris, the god of the underworld, with his arms crossed across his chest, his legs together as though he is a mummy. Under his hands, we see two vultures for the vulture goddess Nekhbet, that being showing that he rules not only Upper but Lower Egypt, with the uraeus cobra of kingship now on his head next to a vulture. So this is the final addition you can see to the left here of the Egyptian pharaonic headgear. So now we still retain the Nimi's headdress, this linen head wrap that goes around the pharaoh's head. Also practical because it protects you against sunburns. But on it now, the pharaoh looks like the hooded cobra that he is intended to imitate and to have the power of. But on his brow, now decorated in lapis lazuli and semi-precious stones, we have an actual cobra and then next to it, the vulture. So again, this goes back to the very beginning in pre-dynastic Egypt of the gods and goddesses worshipped in different regions, from the vulture goddess to the cobra goddess. He still wears, inlaid with lapis lazuli, a false beard. So we find that the death mask, which is the innermost mask that was pressed against the mummy's face in the linen wraps, is going to imitate and continue in a more detailed tradition and fashion what we see here to the right in the innermost coffin, which is just outside of it. So much like Russian nesting dolls, we have these figures within figures within figures, all to protect the pharaoh, to ensure that his ka was not destroyed and that his body remains intact to transition to the afterlife. Because his body was found intact and undisturbed, we can actually reconstruct what the pharaoh looked like thanks to CT scans. And we know that he did not have the same type of deformity as is represented in the Amarna period style. We can reconstruct roughly what he looks like here. Now, if you compare it to the images of the pharaoh in his effigy on his death mask, we note that they are not that different. And so there would have been a common line and or family bloodline that would have been carried through in these dynasties. So they would have looked similar to, but still an idealized version of, actual people. Now, we do know that they were in an incredible rush to complete the mummification process, for they put the mummy inside of the coffin with the death mask over his face on the wet linen wraps. They had not yet dried, and so his face literally glued to the inside of the mask, and it was broken when they tried to remove it initially in the 1920s. Now, turning to the other objects in the tomb here, we can see that it is impossible to completely divest oneself of a style overnight. So the same artists that are working for Akhenaten, creating the works for the Amarna style, then are making the works for Tutankhamen here, Akhenaten's son. So we still see, such as with the lion throne here, which is the same going back to the seated statue of Khafre. Pharaohs are associated with lions and royalty, and so we have lion heads and paws on the ends and the feet of this chair. But if we look carefully at how Tutankhamen is shown, along with the goddess Hathor here, the divine mother of the pharaohs, seen by her horned headdress, we see that the same proportions and design is going to be carried out and continued here, as Akhenaten and Tutankhamen are both shown in the same slouching position, the protruding abdomen and flowing hips being present, and organizing the figures around a gracefully curving contour. Now, accompanying Tutankhamen in his tomb would have been a Book of the Dead, which many mummies are found with if they're found intact at all. Now, a Book of the Dead is a scroll that accompanies mummies with, again, protective spells in them describing what will happen in the afterlife and what to do at each stage. Now, in these collections of spells and prayers, often placed on and between the knees of the deceased, we are going to find that they are seen as quite essential handbooks and guides, so that we know what to expect. What chants do we need? What spells do we need to recant here and or spell out in order to protect ourselves from being eaten in the underworld? Well, here is a standard example of what happens in the afterlife. We often see it painted on the coffins of mummies as well in the Last Judgment of Hunefer. So preceding Christianity by over a millennium, we're going to have a scene of judgment and the weighing of souls that will be the basis for the Christian understanding of what happens at the end of time. Here we have Hunefer, who is identified as the royal scribe and steward of Seti I. Thus, of course, he is buried in the Theban necropolis, or the city of the dead next to Thebes. We begin at the far left in the upper portion, seeing Hunefer kneeling before the pantheon, showing us that he is pious and that he has given gifts and prayers to all of the gods, so that they will look upon him favorably. That is not enough, though, to pass into the afterlife. Below, you often find Hu-Nefer is going to be led, dressed in white, as is all of the figures that are going to be shown in these last judgments. He's led by the left hand by Anubis, the god of mummification with a jackal's head. So remember that he's going to bind the body of Osiris, making him the first mummy. Therefore, you pray to Anubis in order to have a successful mummification process. He holds an ankh in his left hand, showing us that he is leading us to everlasting life in ancient Egypt. Now, Anubis then takes the soul, or Ka, of Hu-Nefer and places it on the left scale, whereas on the right scale we have a feather of the god of judgment and or fairness, Mat. So we find that his heart must be lighter than a feather. And we can see here that, in fact, it is higher than the feather. And so he is able to avoid the horrific ordeal that would have taken place if he were found wanting, and that's Ammit. Ammit is going to be the most ferocious beast Egyptians can imagine. It was a combination of a hippo in his back section, a lion for his torso and front legs, and then a crocodile for a head. So he is the one who will eat your soul, thus blinking you out of existence, destroying you entirely if you are not pure. Because Hu-Nefer is pure, we find that Thoth, the ibis-headed god, and the one who records your name in the book of life, and is also the messenger to the gods, is writing his name down. He has passed. So we see him again now to the right, dressed in white, being led by Horus, the falcon-headed god, who the pharaoh is the incarnation of in this world, holding an ankh with his left hand again, directing him to the next phase. The next phase is going to find the son of Osiris, Horus here, directing and presenting this person who has passed the test to enter into the underworld with Osiris, the god of the underworld, with his sisters Isis and Nephthys behind him. So we find that he's seated like a king. He is going to have his arms across his chest, holding the shepherd's crook and riding crop. These elements which relate him to shepherding a flock, which will also be important for Christianity when we get to it. Now, the conventional proportions of the figures here are going to be consistent with those from the pre-dynastic period. So we're returning to conservatism. We're returning to the proportions that have been used for millennia. And they are able to do so because of the way in which Egyptians are trained and how they draw figures on walls and on papyrus with a grid-like system. In 525 BCE, Egypt falls to the Persians, leaving it to the largest part of an empire that the world has ever known, until 330 BCE, when Alexander the Great overthrows the Persians in the Battle of Issus, and then continues down to conquer Egypt. Now in 30 BCE, Egypt will also be conquered by Rome, with the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra, bequeathing it to the Romans before she commits suicide by asp. Next time, we will look at and turn to the Aegean and look at prehistoric and ancient Aegean art with Cycladic and Minoan art as the predecessors to the great Greek civilization.